Older men aren't afraid of dying alone. They're afraid of wasting the years they have left on someone who destroys their peace. And once a man learns the value of silence, he never trades it for chaos again. There's a quiet truth some older men carry, one they rarely say out loud because they already know how people will react to it. But if you sit with them long enough, if you listen without judging, eventually the truth slips through. It sounds simple, it sounds harsh, but it's honest. They say, "I'd rather be alone than date again." And they don't say it with anger. They don't say it with bitterness. They say it with a strange sense of relief, like a man finally admitting something he's been holding inside for years. Most people don't understand this choice. Families think it's sadness. Friends think it's fear. Society thinks it's some kind of dramatic, unhealthy reaction to aging. But these men know their truth. They aren't avoiding dating because they've given up on connection. They're avoiding it because they finally understand the cost of it. Not just the emotional cost, the cost to their time, their peace, their routines, their stability, their identity. Costs they paid without complaint for decades. When a younger man dates, he sees hope. He sees possibility. He sees a future he still has the strength to build. But an older man sees something completely different. He sees everything dating will require from him: the energy, the compromise, the emotional negotiation, the fear of being used, the pressure to impress, the vulnerability of trusting someone new. He knows exactly how heavy that weight is because he carried it once already. And here's the part people miss. These men aren't choosing loneliness. They're choosing clarity. They're choosing control over their own lives. They're choosing mornings without conflict and nights without emotional tension. They're choosing a life where nothing is being demanded of them anymore. A life where they finally get to be enough on their own. So when an older man says he'd rather be alone, he isn't confessing defeat. He's declaring freedom. He's saying he finally understands what he needs. And what he needs more than anything else is peace. There's something people forget about older men. They've already lived entire lives built around responsibility. Decades of showing up, providing, fixing, supporting, sacrificing, holding everything together, even on days when they felt like they were falling apart inside. Most older men didn't get the luxury of choosing themselves when they were young. They were expected to be the foundation everyone else stood on. And they did it quietly, consistently, without applause. So when people tell them to get back out there and start dating again, they don't realize what they're really asking. They're asking a man who spent his strongest years carrying others to willingly step back into another role that demands more than it gives. They're asking him to pour from a cup that's finally full of his own peace. They're asking him to restart a journey he already finished long ago. A journey that cost him more than anyone around him ever understood. These men remember the emotional labor of relationships, the compromises that slowly erased pieces of themselves, the expectations they were supposed to meet without complaint, the way their wants often took a back seat to everyone else's needs, and they remember how easily their efforts were taken for granted, not out of malice, but because men are expected to endure, absorb, and continue. Now, after decades of doing exactly that, many simply don't have the desire to sign up for another round. Not because they lack the ability, not because they're incapable of love, but because they know with absolute clarity what it cost them the first time. They know how much of their life they invested into relationships, emotionally, financially, mentally, physically, they know how much they gave up. And they know how long it took to rebuild themselves afterward. Dating again means reopening doors they finally closed. It means risking the stability they worked hard to create. It means giving away the parts of themselves they just reclaimed. And for many older men, the math simply doesn't add up anymore. They feel they've already given their best years, and they aren't willing to lose what they have left. There comes a moment in a man's life when he finally understands what real peace feels like. It doesn't happen in his 20s. It usually doesn't happen in his 30s either. Those years are filled with noise. The noise of ambition, the noise of relationships, the noise of other people's expectations. But as men get older, something shifts. The world gets quieter. Their home gets quieter. Their mind gets quieter. And for the first time, they notice how good silence feels. For many older men, peace becomes the most valuable thing they've ever experienced. Not excitement, not romance, not the thrill of starting over. Peace. The kind of peace where you wake up and nothing is demanded from you. The kind of peace where you don't have to measure your words or manage someone's mood. The kind where your home finally feels like a refuge instead of another battlefield. When a man gets a taste of that kind of calm, it's almost impossible for him to give it up, because he remembers how rare it was during most of his life. In relationships, he was the stabilizer, the fixer, the emotional anchor. Even in good relationships, peace wasn't his by default. He had to work for it, maintain it, protect it. It was something constantly at risk of being disrupted. Now, living alone, peace just exists, effortlessly, predictably, quietly, and that quiet becomes addictive. Men discover that solitude isn't empty, it's restorative. It gives them space to think, breathe, heal, and reconnect with the parts of themselves they lost along the way. It gives them evenings without conflict, mornings without tension, weekends without obligations. It gives them a sense of control they never had when compromise ruled everything. So, when people ask older men why they won't date again, the answer is simple. Dating threatens the one thing they value most now, their peace. And once a man builds a life where peace finally sits at the center, he guards it with everything he has, because he knows exactly what it cost him to earn it, and he refuses to lose it again. Trust is something younger people treat lightly, but older men know better. They've lived long enough to understand that trust isn't just a feeling. It's an investment, one that can cost years of your life if you give it to the wrong person. And after decades of relationships, marriages, breakups, divorce settlements, disappointments, or even the death of a partner, rebuilding trust feels less like hope and more like stepping into a storm without cover. Younger men trust easily, because they haven't lost much yet. Older men trust cautiously because they've already lost too much. They know what betrayal feels like. They know what emotional neglect feels like. They know the weight of carrying someone who stopped carrying them back. They know the sting of being misunderstood, dismissed, or taken for granted. These memories don't fade with age. They settle into the bones. So when a new woman comes along and says, "Give it another chance," she doesn't understand the calculation happening inside his mind. Dating again isn't just going to dinner. It's reopening doors to vulnerability. It's exposing the softest parts of himself to someone who hasn't earned them. It's risking emotional wounds that take longer to heal with age. A heartbreak at 25 hurts. A heartbreak at 65 can break a man in ways people don't see. Older men also carry a deeper fear that they won't recover the same way they used to. Starting over once took months. Starting over now could take years. And many simply don't want to lose that time again. They'd rather protect the stability they've built than gamble it on the hope that someone new will treat their heart with care. Trust requires energy, optimism, and vulnerability. 3 things older men no longer give away freely. Not because they're cold, but because they're wise. They've learned that trust is the easiest gift to offer and the hardest one to regain once it's broken. And for many of them, the emotional cost of rebuilding trust simply outweighs the potential reward. They're not guarding their hearts out of fear. They're guarding them out of survival. When older men look at modern dating, they don't feel excitement. They feel disconnected, out of place, and frankly, uninterested. Dating used to be simple. You met someone through friends, through work, at a community event, at a place where people actually knew each other. You talked. You connected. You built something slowly. Today, dating feels more like a competition than a connection. A marketplace where everyone is performing and no one is being real. For older men, this new landscape feels rigged from the start. Dating apps reduce them to a handful of pictures and a short bio. They aren't judged by character, reliability, or wisdom. They're judged by filters, angles, and how well they can sell themselves in a sentence. They feel like they're auditioning instead of meeting someone. And the truth is, most older men don't want to audition for anyone. They also see the reality. Women have hundreds of options. Older men have maybe a handful, and they're expected to compete with younger, flashier, more attention-grabbing men for a chance at someone's time. Most simply won't do it. Not because they can't, but because they don't respect the game. Even when older men do go on dates, they can feel the disconnect immediately. Many women come in with expectations, shaped by years of disappointments, lists, rules, boundaries, tests. Older men aren't interested in being evaluated like employees applying for a job. They're tired of proving themselves, tired of explaining themselves, tired of defending who they are. They want something simple and genuine, and modern dating rarely feels that way. So when they step back from the dating scene, it's not because they're intimidated or bitter. It's because the system feels transactional and exhausting. It asks for effort without guaranteeing sincerity. And older men have finally reached a point where they refuse to give energy to anything that doesn't feed their peace. There's a truth about aging that no one teaches young men. Intimacy changes, not disappears, changes. When a man is young, desire drives everything. Biology is louder than logic. Attraction becomes motivation. The need for connection feels urgent, almost uncontrollable. But as men grow older, the intensity quiets. Not because they stop caring, but because clarity replaces impulse. What once felt like a biological necessity becomes a conscious choice. Older men don't chase intimacy the same way, because they finally understand the cost attached to it. When they were young, they tolerated chaos, drama, mood swings, and misalignment just to feel wanted. But the older a man gets, the less willing he is to trade peace for temporary closeness. Intimacy that comes with stress doesn't feel like intimacy anymore. It feels like a burden. Older men also understand something younger men overlook. Intimacy doesn't fix loneliness. It doesn't fix emptiness. It doesn't fix disconnection. If anything, the wrong intimacy makes those feelings worse. It creates attachment without fulfillment. It creates responsibility without joy. It creates expectations a man no longer has the energy or desire to meet. They also know that intimacy later in life often comes with conditions. They've lived long enough to see how quickly affection can shift based on finances, effort, attention, or emotional compliance. Many older men feel the intimacy becomes something they must earn, rather than something freely shared, and they won't play that game anymore. A man who has lived decades knows the difference between being desired and being used. But here's the real reason older men step away. They've learned that emotional peace lasts longer than physical satisfaction. A quiet morning, a stable routine, an uncluttered mind, those feel better than any temporary connection. That's not a lack of passion. It's wisdom. It's a man choosing long-term well-being over short-term comfort. Older men still value intimacy, but they no longer chase it blindly. It must come without chaos, without conditions, without emotional tolls. If it doesn't add peace to their life, they simply won't let it in. There's a specific moment in a man's life when freedom stops being a desire and becomes a requirement. It usually happens somewhere after 50, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but once it hits, it changes him permanently. He no longer views freedom as something he gets in between relationships. He sees it as the foundation of his well-being, something he refuses to compromise ever again. Older men have lived through decades of responsibility. They've had calendars full of obligations they didn't choose. They've balanced partner needs, family expectations, social pressures, emotional demands, and countless situations where their time didn't belong to them now. Finally, they have mornings that are quiet, predictable, and theirs. They have evenings without negotiation, weekends without commitments, days shaped entirely by their own rhythm. And once they taste that level of autonomy, it becomes sacred. Freedom for an older man isn't about avoiding people. It's about reclaiming himself. It's about waking up without tension. It's about eating what he wants, sleeping when he wants, and structuring his life around peace instead of obligation. It's about hobbies he abandoned, friendships he lost, passions he never had time for. It's about rebuilding the identity that slowly faded while he was busy supporting everyone else. Dating, no matter how promising, threatens that stability. It comes with expectations, routines, compromises, and emotional adjustments. It requires sharing space, time, and attention. It requires negotiation. And older men have reached a phase where negotiation feels like giving away pieces of themselves. They worked too hard to get back. They aren't selfish. They're simply done sacrificing. They spent their younger years building a life for others. Now they want the years that remain to belong entirely to them. They don't want to check in. They don't want to be managed or corrected. They don't want someone rearranging their home, their schedule, or their priorities. They want to breathe freely. Freedom is no longer optional. It's survival. It's sanity. It's dignity. And once an older man has it, he protects it with the same intensity he once protected his family. Because, at this stage of life, freedom isn't just a lifestyle. It's who he's finally allowed to be. Most people think older men avoid dating because they don't want companionship. But that's not the truth. What they really avoid is the hidden weight relationships put on their shoulders. A weight they carried for so many years that they refuse to pick it up again. Younger people assume relationships are 50-50. Older men know they rarely are. They know someone will always take the lead, manage the emotions, carry the stress, and absorb the tension. And in most relationships, that someone was them. Older men remember the emotional labor that never showed up on any balance sheet. The unspoken expectation that they had to be steady while their partner was overwhelmed. The way they adjusted their moods, softened their reactions, and held back their frustrations just to keep the peace. These weren't small tasks. They were daily responsibilities, invisible responsibilities, and they drained men in ways no one around them truly understood. Then there's the caretaking burden no one mentions. When men age, people assume they'll step naturally into the role of emotional support for their partner, her family, her grown children, and whatever problems follow her life. Many men already lived through years of caretaking, sometimes through illness, depression, financial problems, or declining relationships. The idea of doing it again from scratch for someone new is overwhelming. It's not lack of compassion. It's that their emotional reserves aren't limitless anymore. Add to that the social expectations, the events, the family drama, the obligations, the adjustments. Older men know these commitments rarely fade. They only grow, and each commitment chips away at the peace they've finally built. They know stepping into a new relationship means stepping into someone else's world, someone else's needs, someone else's chaos. Older men aren't unwilling to give. They're simply done giving until they collapse. They've learned painfully that relationships don't just require love. They require stamina, emotional stamina, and that is something most older men refuse to spend on a situation that may not last, may not appreciate them, or may cost them the stability they fought so hard to create. When an older man chooses to stay single, the world rushes to label him lonely, avoidant, bitter, afraid of commitment. People assume there must be something wrong with him, because they can't imagine someone choosing a life without partnership. But older men know something most people never learn. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Peace is the absence of chaos. And peace, for many older men, outweighs everything else. Married friends often react the strongest. They'll say things like, "You don't want to grow old alone," or "It's sad to come home to an empty house." Yet these same men often look exhausted, drained, and resentful. Their lives are full of noise, obligations, and constant negotiation. They envy the very freedom they warned their single friends about that. It's strange. The men in cages are the ones telling the free man he should climb back inside. Family pressure doesn't help either. Adult children worry they'll have to take care of him someday. Siblings say he's giving up. Society implies he's incomplete without a partner. But none of these opinions come from understanding his reality. They come from fear. Fear that his choice challenges their assumptions about happiness, marriage, and aging. If he's content, alone, what does that say about the sacrifices they're still making? But older men tune out the noise. They listen to something quieter, something more honest. Their own experience. They know they sleep better alone. They know their home is calmer without conflict. They know their money, time, and energy flow toward things they value, not things they're pressured into. They know the difference between companionship that enriches life and companionship that suffocates it. When older men say they choose to be single, they're not rejecting love. They're rejecting chaos. They're rejecting stress. They're rejecting situations that take more than they give. The world calls it loneliness. But men who have lived long enough to know themselves call it something far deeper, far richer, and far more valuable: peace. People assume older men fear dying alone. They imagine some dramatic, tragic ending where a man reaches old age with no one beside him, regretting every choice he ever made. But ask older men today. Really ask them, and you'll hear something completely different. They're not afraid of dying alone. They're afraid of spending the years they have left living a life that doesn't feel like their own. They're afraid of losing their identity, their routine, their mental clarity, their independence, all the things they fought years to reclaim. You see, older men don't think about death the way younger people imagine. They think about life, the quality of it, the peace of it, the ownership of it. They ask themselves one simple question: what kind of life do I want to live with the time I have left? And for many of them, the answer is a life without conflict, without pressure, without emotional demands, without someone reshaping their world again. Dying alone isn't the nightmare. Dying drained, controlled, unfulfilled, or resentful, that's what terrifies them. They spent their early years trying to be everything for everyone. They spent their middle years recovering from the cost of those early years. Now, in this final stretch, they want something they rarely had before. A life that belongs to them. A life shaped by their choices, not their obligations. If love appears in that space naturally, without force, without sacrifice, without chaos, they might welcome it. But they will no longer bend their lives to chase it. They won't bargain for peace. They won't trade stability for company. They won't give up the freedom they earned through pain, loss, and hard lessons. Choosing to be alone isn't about avoiding death. It's about protecting life. Their life, the one they built, the one they finally understand, the one they refuse to compromise ever again. So when an older man says he'd rather be alone, he isn't expressing hopelessness. He's expressing sovereignty. He's declaring that his peace, his autonomy, and his identity are worth more than any relationship could ever offer. And that isn't fear. That's freedom.